Imagine for a moment that all the structures holding your reality together suddenly vanish. I am not just talking about the fall of a government or an economic collapse, but the total evaporation of basic trust between human beings. Imagine walking out onto the street and every person you make eye contact with isn't a neighbor, a fellow citizen, or a friend, but a lethal competitor who either craves what you have or fears that you want what they possess. In this absolute void, there is no property, no justice, and no laws. There is only the natural right of every individual to protect their own life by any means necessary, including violence. This nightmare vision isn't the script of a trendy post-apocalyptic movie, but the starting point for one of the most influential, dark, and honest works in the history of Western thought. We are talking about Leviathan, the masterpiece written by Thomas Hobbes in the year 1651. To understand why a man decided to write a treatise of nearly 600 pages on absolute power, we must first travel to 17th century England. Thomas Hobbes was not some armchair theorist speculating about peace from the comfort of a silent library. Hobbes was a man who defined himself as a twin of fear. He used to say that his mother had given birth to twins, himself and fear, because he was born prematurely in 1588 when the Spanish Armada was threatening the English coast. That foundational fear stayed with him his entire life and reached its climax during the English Civil War, a bloody conflict that pitted supporters of the king against defenders of Parliament. Hobbes saw his country tearing itself apart, seeing brothers kill brothers in the name of religion or liberty, and he reached a terrifying conclusion. The greatest evil that can befall humanity is not tyranny but anarchy. For Hobbes, disorder is hell on earth, and any price, no matter how high, is worth paying to avoid that state of war of every man against every man. This premise forces us to dive into the deep psychology that Hobbes proposes at the start of his work. Before speaking to us of kings and laws, Hobbes speaks of particles in motion. He was a radical materialist, influenced by the scientific breakthroughs of his time and by figures like Galileo Galilei. For Hobbes, a human being is not a spiritual soul trapped in a body, but an extremely complex biological machine. Everything we feel, think, or desire is the result of internal movements caused by external stimuli. Sensation is merely movement in our sensory organs. Imagination is a sensation that weakens over time, and thought is a chain of mechanical associations. This vision strips the human being of any mystical halo and places us on the plane of pure physics. If we are machines driven by desire and repelled by pain, our behavior becomes predictable and, in Hobbes's eyes, deeply selfish by biological necessity. This idea that we are biological automatons leads to his concept of power. Hobbes defines a man's power as his present means to obtain some future apparent good. But here lies the tragic problem of our species. Because the future is uncertain and we will always need resources to survive, we can never be satisfied with the level of power we have today. Hobbes describes a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death. It is not that humans are naturally evil in a moral or religious sense, it is that we are programmed for self-preservation in a world of limited resources. If you have a piece of land and I fear I will lack food tomorrow, my instinct will push me to take it from you before you decide that my very existence is a threat to you. This analysis leads us inevitably to the famous state of nature. It is important to clarify that Hobbes didn't necessarily believe there was a specific historical moment where all humans lived like savages in the woods, though he cited the example of American peoples of his time to give credibility to his theory. The state of nature is, above all, a psychological thought experiment. What would happen if we remove the state, the police, the judges, and social norms? What remains is radical equality. But this is not an equality of rights that we would celebrate today, but an equality in the capacity to kill. Hobbes notes with clinical coldness that even the weakest man has enough strength to kill the strongest, whether by secret machination or by confederacy with others. This equality of ability generates an equality of hope in attaining our ends. And if two people desire the same thing and cannot both enjoy it, they become enemies. In this state of nature, there is no productive labor because no one can be sure that the fruits of their effort won't be snatched away. There is no agriculture, no maritime trade, no comfortable buildings, no arts, and no letters. There is only continual fear and danger of violent death. It is here that Hobbes writes his most famous and quoted phrase describing the life of man in that state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is an existence where justice and injustice have no place, because where there is no common power, there is no law, and where there is no law, there is no injustice. Force and fraud are, in war, the two cardinal virtues. This description is so raw that it has sparked centuries of debate over whether Hobbes's vision is too pessimistic, but for him, it was simply realism based on observing human behavior when institutions collapse. But a human being doesn't just have irrational desires, they also possess reason. And it is reason that offers us a way out of this blood-soaked labyrinth. Hobbes introduces here the laws of nature. We must not confuse them with the civil laws dictated by a government. For Hobbes, a law of nature is a precept or general rule discovered by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive to his life. The first and fundamental law of nature is to seek peace and follow it. However, Hobbes knows that covenants without the sword are but words. I can promise you I won't attack you, but if there is no one to punish me for breaking my promise, you would be a fool to trust me and not arm yourself first. Therefore, reason dictates that we must be willing, when others are too, to lay down our right to all things and be contented with so much liberty against others as we would allow them against ourselves. This mutual transferring of rights is what we call the social contract. But unlike later theorists like John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hobbes's contract has a unique and radical characteristic. It is not a contract between the people and the ruler. It is a contract of every individual with every other individual. It is as if every person said to everyone else, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. By doing this, the multitude is united in one person called the Commonwealth, or in Latin, the Civitas. This is the birth of the great Leviathan, that mortal god to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense. The name of the work is a reference to the sea monster from the book of Job in the Bible, a creature of such power that nothing on earth can compare to it. Hobbes uses this metaphor deliberately to symbolize that the power of the state must be absolute and indivisible. The sovereign, whether a king or an assembly, must have total control over the military, the judiciary, the collection of taxes, and even over what religious or political doctrines are taught in public. Why? Because any division of power is an invitation to civil war. If power is divided between the king and parliament or between the state and the church, sooner or later there will be a conflict of loyalties and the people will be dragged back into the state of nature. For Hobbes, the sovereign cannot commit injustice against his subjects because every subject is, by the original contract, the author of every act the sovereign performs. To criticize the sovereign is, in essence, to criticize oneself. This point usually generates immediate resistance in the modern reader, raised on the values of democracy and human rights. But to fully understand Hobbes's logic, we must apply what we might call the lens of absolute security. Hobbes argues that liberty, understood as the absence of external impediments, is something men value highly, but is incompatible with total peace. In the state of nature, we have absolute liberty, but that liberty is useless because we have no security that we will live another day. Therefore, the trade-off Hobbes proposes is clear. You surrender almost all your liberty in exchange for guaranteed security. The sovereign is above civil laws because he is the source of the law. He cannot be punished, he cannot be legally deposed, and he has the right to decide what is necessary for the peace of the realm. It is fascinating to observe how Hobbes deconstructs the idea of justice. In his system, justice is not an eternal moral value or a platonic idea residing in the heavens. Justice is simply the performance of covenants. If there is no power to compel the fulfillment of covenants, the concept of justice is meaningless. This leads us to a purely legalistic and pragmatic view of coexistence. The sovereign is like the referee in a soccer match. You might not like his decisions, but without a referee whose decisions are final and cannot be questioned, the game simply cannot exist and turns into a tavern brawl. However, Hobbes is not a defender of gratuitous cruelty. Although the sovereign's power is absolute, its purpose is the protection of the lives of his subjects. If the sovereign becomes so weak that he can no longer protect us, or if he orders a man to take his own life or end the life of his own father, the subject has the natural right to resist, because the end of the contract was self-preservation. Hobbes is the first great thinker to put the right to life at the center of politics, displacing ideas of glory, honor, or religious salvation as the primary ends of the state. The Hobbesian state is a technical tool, a machine designed for a single purpose: to keep us from killing each other. To dive even deeper into this architecture of power, we must look at the relationship between state and religion, a subject that occupies almost half the book and is often ignored in superficial summaries. Hobbes devotes an immense section to what he calls the kingdom of darkness. For him, darkness is not just the absence of light, but the mental confusion caused by erroneous interpretations of scripture and the influence of abstract philosophies that have no basis in material reality. Hobbes deeply feared the power of the church, whether Catholic or radical Protestant sects, because they offered citizens an authority higher than that of the earthly sovereign. If a priest tells you that you will go to hell if you obey the king, and the king tells you he will execute you if you don't, you find yourself in an impossible position that breaks the cohesion of the state. Hobbes' solution is as radical as the rest of his work. The sovereign must also be the head of the church. There cannot be two heads on one body. He interprets the Bible in a way we would today call Erastianism, where the civil ruler decides which books are canonical and how miracles should be interpreted. Hobbes seeks to demystify politics and religion so that the citizen knows exactly to whom they owe obedience. This obsession with clarity and avoiding ambiguity in language is one of Hobbes' greatest contributions to philosophy. He believed that most human conflicts arise from the misuse of words or the use of absurd terms that mean nothing, such as essence, incorporeal substance, or free will in the metaphysical sense. For him, freedom of the will does not exist. Only freedom of action exists when there are no physical obstacles. If we turn our gaze to the current relevance of these ideas, we realize that Hobbes is more modern than we would like to admit. Think of the rise of technology and mass surveillance. In many ways, the algorithms of big digital platforms or the social credit systems of some modern states act as a new digital Leviathan. We agreed to surrender our privacy and control over our data in exchange for security, convenience, and access to a technologically efficient social order. Hobbes' question still echoes in the halls of data centers. How much liberty are we willing to sacrifice for the promise that there will be no chaos? In the field of contemporary neuroscience, Hobbes' vision of human beings as information processing systems driven by electrochemical impulses of attraction and repulsion is finding surprising echoes. Modern brain studies often describe decision-making as a competitive process of neuronal signals where the strongest desire prevails, a biological version of what Hobbes called deliberation, which for him was nothing more than the last appetite in a chain of desires before action. By viewing man as a machine, Hobbes anticipated the era of artificial intelligence and biotechnology, where the boundary between the natural and the artificial becomes increasingly blurred. He himself calls the state an artificial man, a human creation designed to imitate natural man but with much greater strength and stature for our protection. We can also connect Hobbes to modern game theory, specifically the famous prisoner's dilemma. In this scenario, two people who cannot communicate end up betraying each other, even though cooperation would yield a better result for both, simply because they fear the other will betray them first. Hobbes' state of nature is, in essence, a global-scale prisoner's dilemma. The Leviathan is the external mechanism that changes the rules of the game, ensuring that the cost of betrayal is so high that cooperation becomes the most rational option for everyone. Without that external referee, individual rationality leads us inevitably to the collective irrationality of war. If we analyze current popular culture, we see the shadow of the Leviathan in series and movies that explore the collapse of civilization. From zombie narratives to urban dystopias, what truly terrifies us in those stories isn't the monsters, but the disappearance of Hobbesian law. We are terrified to realize that, without the structure of the state, man often behaves as a wolf to man. The famous phrase, homo homini lupus, that Hobbes popularized, though he wasn't the first to use it. This vision forces us to confront the fragility of our institutions. Hobbes reminds us that social order is not a natural fact like gravity, but an extremely delicate human artifact that requires constant maintenance and shared obedience. But not everything in Hobbes is darkness and control. There is a deep philosophical melancholy in his work that deserves exploration. Hobbes recognizes that the human quest for happiness is not a state of tranquility or peace of mind. He says there is no such thing as the finis ultimus or the summum bonum of ancient philosophers. Happiness is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, where the attaining of the former is but the way to the latter. We are condemned to constant dissatisfaction. This is the tragedy of the human condition according to Hobbes. We are beings defined by our lack and our fear, and our only salvation is the creation of a collective structure that allows us to live with a minimum of dignity despite our selfish nature. As we move toward a deeper deconstruction of his legacy, we must consider the criticism leveled at him from the psychology of cooperation. Recent research in anthropology suggests that primitive humans were not necessarily as violent as Hobbes imagined, and that community cooperation was a key evolutionary advantage. However, Hobbes would respond that such cooperation only works in small groups of kin or acquaintances. The moment societies grow and individuals become strangers to one another, biological bonds of empathy break down, and only the fear of punishment remains as social glue. The Leviathan is necessary precisely because we no longer live in tribes, but in nations of millions of people who will never meet. Hobbes' influence on the political realism of international relations is incalculable. Many experts suggest that the world today, on a global plane, still lives in a Hobbesian state of nature. There is no world sovereign with absolute power to punish nations that break covenants. Therefore, each country must arm itself and distrust its neighbors as individuals did in Hobbes' imaginary forest. International peace is nothing more than a balance of fears, an armed truce that lasts as long as the risk of war outweighs the potential benefits of aggression. It is important to reflect on the role of education in the Hobbesian system. Hobbes believed the sovereign should control universities and pulpits because that is where the ideas that can lead to rebellion are sown. If people are taught they have an individual right to judge what is good and evil above the law of the state, the seed of civil war has already been planted. To a modern reader, this sounds like totalitarian censorship, but for Hobbes, it is a measure of public health. He compares seditious opinions to a poison that infects the body politic. His logic is that it is better to limit freedom of speech than to allow words to become weapons that destroy society. This is a tension we see today in debates over hate speech and disinformation on social media, where it is questioned whether the state or corporations should intervene to protect social stability at the cost of the individual freedom to say whatever one wants. But to understand this fully, we must look at the structure of the book itself. Leviathan is not just a book of politics, it is an architectural work. Hobbes begins with the atom, sensation, builds the molecule, the individual, then the organism, the state, and finally the security system, laws, and religion. It is an ambitious attempt to create a total science of humanity. His literary style is direct, sharp, and lacking in unnecessary flourishes. He wrote like a mathematician, trying to prove his points from basic definitions. This leads us to one of the most fascinating aspects of his thought, his absolute faith in logic. He believed that if we could agree on the definitions of words, war would be impossible because reason would force us to accept the same political conclusions. The problem, of course, is that human beings are creatures of passion before logic, and Hobbes was smart enough to know that the passion of fear is much more powerful than pure reason. This leads us inevitably to another crucial aspect of his work, the notion of representation. Hobbes is one of the fathers of the concept of political representation. The sovereign is not necessarily a moral superior. He is an actor performing the role of the person of the state. The citizens are the authors and the sovereign is the actor. By using this theatrical language, Hobbes shows us that power is an artificial construct, a necessary fiction that we all agree to believe so as not to die at the hands of our neighbor. It is a kind of voluntary collective hypnosis. We know the king is just a man, but we agree to treat him as if he were a giant composed of all of us because that illusion is the only thing separating us from the abyss. The deconstruction of Leviathan also reveals a deep contempt for classical metaphysics. Hobbes spends many pages attacking Aristotle and the scholastics of the Middle Ages. He called their teachings a vain philosophy of meaningless words. By rejecting the idea that there is a natural justice or a divine law accessible by faith, Hobbes opens the door to secular modernity. The state is no longer justified because God ordered it through the divine right of kings, though Hobbes uses biblical quotes to support his case, but because it is the rational solution to a technical problem of survival. The state is a human invention for humans, stripped of magic but invested with terrifying power. In thinking about Hobbes' legacy, we must recognize that his brutal honesty forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Is it true that at the bottom of our hearts we only care about our own skin? Is it true that we only obey laws out of fear of punishment and not out of a sense of moral duty? If the police disappeared tomorrow, would you still respect the property and lives of others? Hobbes bets that most of us, if we are honest, would lock our doors at night, just as he said even those who criticized his pessimistic vision did. For him, the simple act of locking your house door or putting a padlock on your chest is daily proof that secretly you agree with him about human nature. This connection to everyday reality allows us to see that Leviathan is not just a historical treatise, but a mirror. A mirror that reflects an image we would rather not see, that of a creature which, under its thin layer of civilization, culture, and good manners, is still driven by the same fears and desires as its ancestors in the caves. Hobbes doesn't ask us to be better people, he asks us to be realistic people. His political proposal doesn't seek utopia, it seeks to avoid dystopia. He doesn't want to make us happy, he wants us to stay alive. And in a world that often seems on the brink of chaos, whether from climate crises, geopolitical conflicts, or social tearing, that minimal promise of security starts to sound like a tempting offer once again. Hobbes' relevance also extends to how we understand authority in emergency situations. During pandemics or natural disasters, we often see how societies accept severe restrictions on their individual liberties in the name of public health or national security. In those moments, the Leviathan wakes from its slumber and we remember why we granted it so much power. The Hobbesian justification that security is the prerequisite for any other liberty becomes the central argument of governments in times of crisis. It is the reminder that the social pact is not something we signed once in the past, but something we renew every time we choose obedience to avoid uncertainty. However, to complete our 360-degree view, we must consider the inherent danger in Hobbes' system. If we grant all power to a sovereign to prevent us from killing each other, who will prevent the sovereign from killing us? This is the great dilemma that Hobbes leaves not entirely resolved. His answer is that the sovereign has a rational interest in keeping his subjects alive and prosperous, because a sovereign of poor and weak subjects is a weak sovereign. But history has shown us that rulers are not always rational actors, and that the Leviathan can easily become a monster that devours its own creators. This tension between the need for order and the fear of abuse of power is the engine that has driven political evolution for the last 4 centuries, from absolute monarchies to constitutional democracies that try, with varying success, to chain the Leviathan without stripping it of its protective strength. At the end of the road, reading Thomas Hobbes is a transformative experience because it removes the blinders of idealism. It forces us to look into the center of our deepest anxieties and to recognize that society is a fragile achievement, an island of order in an ocean of entropy. His voice, from the 17th century, continues to speak to us with a chilling clarity about the price of peace and the nature of power. It is not a message of comfort, it is a message of warning. He tells us that the great Leviathan is necessary, but he also reminds us that it is a creature made by us, a projection of our own needs and fears. As we explore the final corners of this deconstruction, we realize that the Leviathan is ultimately a monument to the human will to survive. Despite our supposed natural brutality, we have had the astounding capacity to imagine and build complex structures that allow us to collaborate, create art, and seek knowledge. The fact that we need a strong state not to kill each other is, paradoxically, proof of our immense potential for conflict, but also of our supreme intelligence in avoiding it. Hobbes, the twin of fear, handed us a map of our own shadows so that we could find the way toward the light of a lasting peace, even if that light is, by necessity, guarded by the sword of the sovereign. Concluding this journey through Hobbes's thought doesn't mean closing the book, but opening our eyes to the reality of our coexistence. The Leviathan lives on among us, in every traffic light we respect, in every contract we sign, and in every moment we trust that the stranger walking toward us will not do us harm. It is a structure of thought that, although born from the smoke of an English civil war, has proven to have universal endurance. By understanding Hobbes, we understand ourselves a bit better and the invisible forces that hold us together. It is a lesson in humility and realism that invites us to value peace not as a natural state of things, but as the most precious and artificial of human treasures. The big lesson is that coexistence is not a gift, it is a contract that we must be willing to defend and understand every day of our lives, always remembering that the alternative is to return to that dark forest where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and tragic. Thus we close this deep analysis, recognizing in the pages of this 17th century man the keys to deciphering the challenges of our own time.